All right, good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing today? I am the Director of Learning Resources here at the North Campus. My name is Israel Sanchez, and I would like to thank you so much for participating in this event. Particularly, I would like to thank our faculty who are joining us today, our speakers as well, our students, and a special thanks to the Humanities Edge for sponsoring this event. Fun fact is we have not had a face-to-face event since 2020. This is our first. And that makes me very, very happy because it's great to see our college community come to the library. This is how it used to be before the pandemic. We had events almost twice a month. So we're very happy and satisfied to see you here today. What a better way to celebrate our face-to-face event or to kick off our face-to-face event than with a celebration of Black History Month. Today's event will highlight the contributions African Americans have made in three particular areas. That's the visual arts, culinary arts, and literature. You'll have an opportunity today to hear from our speakers, enjoy some soul food, and also take a look at some of the wonderful art made by our very own Miami-Dade College student. So why don't we get started? And I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Ms. Ariane Tulloch, who serves as our academic writing coach. She is the lead organizer for this event, and also she holds a master's degree in anthropology. And her academic interests include space and place. She will be speaking briefly about art. All right, Ariane, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Israel. Hopefully you guys can all hear me. Okay, great. So a couple housekeeping things before we start. As Israel mentioned, we have Humanities Edge to thank for this. And so at each of your tables, you'll notice books and then a little QR code at the bottom. If you could scan that QR code and just answer the questions, that's for Humanities Edge to let them know who came and to know what the numbers were. Right. And I will ask you to do that one more time at the end of this event, and that'll be a survey to get your opinion on how things were. All right, so are any of you able to name any African American artists that are practicing nowadays? Any prominent African American artists who are practicing? Okay, what kind of art does she do? Okay, excellent. Any others? What about 50 years ago? Any artists, African American artists who did artwork 50 years ago? So, if you're unable to, that's okay. This presentation is a brief survey of arts and artists, particularly African Americans who have contributed to American art. And when I talk about art, I mean that in the broadest sense. So not just art, visual art, but artisans, craftsmen, so wood making, blacksmithing, clothing making, sewing. That's what I'm considering to be art. So we will look at art from the colonial period, and here you have a couple of artists whom you might want to check out, all the way to present day. Next slide, please. Good. And again, there are some artists there whom you might find interesting. So what's really interesting is that when we look at art that was produced in the colonial period and in the antebellum period, we don't see a lot of names attached to the art that's produced. And that could be for a couple of reasons. One reason is because slaves during that time were not able to read and write. In fact, it was illegal to teach a slave how to read or write. And so when they were creating these works, they weren't going to sign their names. Another reason might be perhaps because whatever the slave produced was the property of the master. And so what you saw was that a lot of inventions that were created, for instance, were assigned to the master and not the slave who actually created them. Oh, no, not yet. So if we look at these three pieces of artwork, they're really interesting. This figure on the first image, but the figure on the right of it was a figurine that was found under the dirt floor of a blacksmithing workshop near slave quarters in Alexandria, Virginia. And what's really interesting about it is that it's very similar to the figure to the left of it. And that was actually a figurine that comes from East Bamana, which is now Western Mali. And this is to show that when the slaves came to the United States, they took the knowledge that they had in Africa, ironsmithing, blacksmithing, and they brought it to the States, and it influenced the creations that they made. The second figure that you see is a cigar store Indian. And a cigar store Indian is an emblem that shop owners used to use to sell tobacco. Unfortunately, Native Americans were associated with tobacco, and during the antebellum period and the colonial period, a large segment of the US population didn't know how to read. And so one way to advertise to them was by associating images with things that they knew. So this figure that we have in the middle is a cigar store Indian, and the archaeologists who found it believe that it was created by Job, a freeman of Freehold, New Jersey. And they say that it's different from the Indian that you see to the right of it because the way that it was made. Generally, cigar store Indians were cut from one long piece of wood, and then the arms were attached. In the figure in the middle, you will see that that figure was constructed by 13 different pieces, and those were all attached to one another. And the fineness with which they were attached suggests that the person who attached them worked in a job such as carpentry. And that was a job that a lot of African Americans did in the antebellum period. And this is another example of cigar store Indians. We don't see them often nowadays, but just so that you know what they look like. So I'd mentioned earlier that when we talk about art, I mean art in its broadest sense. Elizabeth Keckley is a woman who designed dresses. And she's really interesting because she was able to buy herself out of slavery, manumission, by making dresses. And she was so good that she became the dressmaker for Mary Todd Lincoln, right? Abraham Lincoln's wife. Again, going back to something that I said earlier in the presentation about a lot of African Americans not knowing how to read during the colonial period and during slavery, what people used to do was put their history into something tangible. So something like quilts. So this is the Bible quilt, and it was created by Harriet Powers, a former slave. And what she did was put different scenes from the Bible in this quilt. And this is really interesting because the way that she made this quilt speaks to her West African roots. So I'm going to go closer to this, to the image and show you a couple things. So here you'll see that there are panels, but the panels are broken by orange squares. So the orange squares break the pattern. And in West African societies, and also some Asian societies, there's a belief that evil spirits travel in straight lines. So if you break up those lines, then you confuse the spirits and you ward them away. That's exactly what she's doing with those little orange squares that you see. Duncanson is a great artist to know because he worked on behalf of African Americans through the abolitionist movement. So in the 18th and 19th centuries, when you saw depictions of African Americans, they were portrayed as simpletons, as fools. But Duncanson challenged that notion. He didn't paint a lot of people, he did a lot of landscapes, but the fact that he was self-taught spoke against the idea that African Americans were simple, right? Because this was a man who was producing great artwork and he taught himself. And one of the reasons that I wanted to feature him was because of this painting. Has anyone seen this painting before? Is he, yes, no? So this painting was actually featured at Biden's inaugural luncheon. And so that's another reason why I wanted to include Duncanson in this talk. So going back to how African Americans have been able to capture their history in art and in painting, here is someone who does just that. Aaron Douglas has drawn and painted the African American history from slavery to Reconstruction, a series. And here you'll start to see that artists are experimenting with different styles. So he actually paints in Cubism. And his paintings are very two-dimensional, very flat, and he uses a lot more colors than what we've seen before, a lot more vivid colors. Jacob Lawrence was the student of Aaron Douglas, and you can see similarities in their paintings. Again, he uses a lot of two-dimensional drawings as opposed to three-dimensional ones, bright colors as well, vivid colors. And his artwork really is reminiscent of Douglas's. We get to our first photographer here. So while Jacob Lawrence is producing in the late 60s, Doris Derby is taking pictures in the late 1960s. And she actually works on behalf of the civil rights movement for SNCC. She documents African Americans in everyday environments, and also the protest movements that are taking place during the 1960s. So here's an image of daily life in Mississippi. The next paintings, though, that you see, or the next pictures, though, that you see, speak to what was going on during that time period. So that second picture, the children protesting, what they're asking to do is to close down to close down a pool that was segregated. When we think about African American art as a topic of study, we have David Driscoll to thank for that. He was instrumental in creating African American art as a field of study. And he was a painter in and of himself in his own right. So I heard a couple mms, so I'm guessing he's someone whom you know. What do you know about him? He is incredibly controversial. So Basquiat was actually born in the 60s. So right around the time that Doris Derby, the photographer whom we saw, was taking pictures, Jean-Michel Basquiat was born. And I included that first picture, a portrait of Shannon Dawson, just to show you that he had skill, because a lot of times people might look at his paintings and think, oh, he can't paint or he can't draw. No, the way that he painted or the way that he drew was a choice, but he really could draw. He was a very good artist. So Basquiat's paintings are different from the paintings that we saw before. His are more childlike. He has vivid use of colors. He was a graffiti artist before, and so that sort of creeps into his work. He'll have, from time to time, words and sayings on his artwork. And one thing that people who study his art look at, are crowns. If you look at Basquiat's art, he uses a lot of crowns, and the crowns point to contradictions in life. So the rich and the poor, race, class, he uses his crowns to sort of provoke questions about those things. Weems is another photographer, and she looks at Black women. She focuses on their relationships with one another, with themselves, with their families, and she does that beautifully in this kitchen table series. All of her pictures are centered around the kitchen table. And this is a great series to know, From here, I saw what happened and cried. So what Weems does here is she looks at how photography has influenced our ideas about race, racism, social class, and she uses sort of instrumental figures or instrumental images to provoke questions about what photography is doing, what it's saying. I hope that this artist, at least the artwork, Kehinde Wiley. So obviously he's famous for painting Obama's portrait during the latter years of his presidency. And what you'll see with this picture and the picture that comes after is that he loves to play with backgrounds. The backgrounds are all very vivid, and many of them have flowers in them. Okay. So here are some examples. And another thing that he is famous for doing is drawing or painting 17th century pictures or 18th century pictures and putting Black men in them. So he sort of mixes the old with the new. And if you notice, this man on the horse is very modern. The clothes, the dress, and it's sort of contrasts with the background. Amy Sherrod is another artist whom you may know. And again, it's because she worked painting someone from the first family, Michelle Obama. And her backgrounds are different. They're more subdued. And so you really pay attention to the portrait, to the people who are focused in her paintings. And then finally, I wanted to show you where we might be going. So a lot of this presentation talked about the past and the present, but Afrofuturism, are you familiar with that term by any chance? Okay, so Afrofuturism is a literary movement, an artistic movement that speculates what life would be like in the future, and it looks at that speculation from the perspective of Blacks and African Americans. So with that being said, I'm going to turn the floor over to Israel so that he can properly introduce Tiffany.
Thank you so much, Ariane. That was wonderful. And I'm sure we're all going to be looking up these new artists that we're learning about. And it's great to create awareness of different aspects of art. Okay, so next we have Tiffany Walker, who serves as a librarian at the Padron campus, who is joining us today. She holds a master's degree in library science from Florida State University and a bachelor's degree in anthropology from the University of Florida. She also has a background in English literature, studying with Dr. Gregory Hampton at Howard University for 2 years. While at Howard, Tiffany specialized in Afrofuturism and Black science fiction. Tiffany has presented on the topic of Black science fiction at conferences for organizations such as the National Council for Black Studies and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Her presentations have centered in Black female protagonists in science fiction and Black women who write science fiction. Welcome, Tiffany.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. But yeah, I'm more of a projecting speaker, so thankfully this is the barrier between us. Alrighty, so Israel, you're gonna help me with my slides. Thank you so much. So we're not gonna spend too much time focusing on like defining Afrofuturism and what it is, because today is more of an interactive type of presentation. So after we introduce the topic, we're actually going to spend some time speculating and actually being active in the Afrofuturistic space. So I'm hoping that you guys are in the mood to participate. Please and thank you. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and introduce this. Before we even jump into the topic, I want to encourage everyone to consider who you are dedicating your participation to, right? So it's okay to kind of sit around and listen to someone talk at you, but when you are in an academic space, we always want to consider the people who have helped us to get to the spot where we are right now. And so for me, anytime I do a presentation on Afrofuturism, I always dedicate it to Dr. Patricia Hilliard-Nunn. She was my faculty advisor at the University of Florida, and she was the first Black woman, Black professor to ever invest in me and actually encourage me. And she was the person that basically told me that Afrofuturism was a topic that you could research and that it was something you could present on. So she's the reason, and I want to encourage everyone to maybe take a moment and consider, who are you participating for? Next slide. Alrighty, so when it comes to Afrofuturism, a lot of the times people want to define it as something specific, and I don't really think that there is an agreed upon definition for Afrofuturism, because it will depend upon essentially what area you are approaching it from, right? People in the arts describe it differently from people in the literature, from people who are approaching it from a musical perspective. Everyone has a different lens for describing Afrofuturism, but in my opinion, it's essentially inclusive of arts, music, film, dance, all these different media that are created by the African diaspora to investigate the relationship between race, science, and technoculture in our speculations about the future, right? So you do have several examples that I'm going to show you of Afrofuturism in different media. The first one is going to be Afrofuturism in art, which Arian so gracefully kind of introduced you to, right? So it's not just oil paintings. People are also doing sculptures. The first image is actually a deck of tarot cards that I own, which I love to use. It's called Dust to Onyx. It was created by Courtney Alexander. And then the middle one is actually digital art as well. So these are all people who are active on social media and Instagram that you can follow, who are engaged in Afrofuturism from an artistic perspective. We also have Afrofuturism in music, which is on the next slide. So Afrofuturism in music can appear not only in the context of the songs that are being sang, but also the visions, right? The visuals. When I was growing up, music videos were everything, right? So a lot of the times people would not even really chart their songs until they made a really good music video about it. And so when you're thinking about Afrofuturism in music, the visuals have a lot to do with it as well, right? So you have Afrofuturistic representations in Erykah Badu. You have Sun Ra, who's the man in the middle there. Everyone knows Janelle Monáe, I would hope, because she's very active and current right now. And then even like Parliament Funkadelic, which is a band, that was going around in like the 60s and 70s, right? They had a very Afrofuturistic perspective to their music. And even more contemporary rappers like Travis Scott engage in Afrofuturism in their art and in their music. So we want to consider that perspective as well. Afrofuturism is present in film, and a lot of us are familiar with a lot of these different films here. For some reason, Will Smith has the most Afrofuturistic films that I could find of any other black man, right? Because he was in I Am Legend. He has this film with his son, After Earth. He also has I, Robot, which he participated in. So I don't know what's going on there. Maybe someone needs to research that. That could be someone's proposal. But Will Smith is quite active in Afrofuturistic films. And then you even have, Afrofuturism in Star Trek with LeVar Burton, who was playing, Geordi in Star Trek. So, and then obviously Black Panther. A lot of people consider this fantasy and comic, but if you think about the use of technology and the scale in which technology plays a role, in that film, that can be considered Afrofuturistic as well. So there are different perspectives. And then the last one, which is what we're going to be expounding upon, is Afrofuturism in literature, right? So these are just a couple of book covers from Afrofuturistic writers that are fairly contemporary, in my opinion. But we'll also look at some people who are writing well before these writers. Afrofuturism in writing is budding. It's for some reason, something happened between the 90s and now there's an explosion of people writing Black science fiction, particularly Afrofuturism, which is a subgenre of that. And so we're going to be exploring some of those right there. Alrighty, so Afrofuturism, science fiction, where does it all fall on the grand scale of all this writing stuff, right? There is a particular emphasis on speculation when it comes to Afrofuturism, right? And what I like to describe, speculative fiction is essentially asking the question of what if? And that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be asking a lot of what if questions, right? So it's what if, and then it creates a narrative that is speculating on the outcome of that question. And it does overlap with horror and history, alternate history, which is a cool thing that Afrofuturism explores as well. You also have, a lot of science fiction and fantasy is all, dredged up in there. So Afrofuturism, as I said, it's so difficult to describe because one Afrofuturistic novel to the next incorporates all these varying elements from different other subgenres of science fiction. Alrighty, so what does speculation look like? Yeah, in Afrofuturism, right? So Afrofuturism speculations, they're also asking what if, but they're using the lens of the Black experience to explore these possibilities, right? So as a subgenre of science fiction, Afrofuturism, it basically challenges the invisibility of people of color from these sci-fi narratives, right? And the erasure of people of color from very Euro-American futurism. I stumble over that word because it's so long. But Afrofuturism writers are essentially imagining this future that's driven by Black experience, and then they're also using these narratives to intersect with themes of technology, utopia, dystopia. You have gender, ecological, and environmental concerns are all mixed in there with sexuality. That's all toppled over with the Black identity. So all of these intersections are happening when you're discussing Black people in the future. It's not just a monolith of robots and technology. There's a lot of other things that are being addressed, concerns of a community that are being addressed when we're talking about Black people in the future. All right, so where does the term come from? So historically, science fiction has always speculated about what the future would look like. And in the late 20th century, a lot of the science fiction that was being written by predominantly white writers was talking about technology. And, they were speculating on what would technology be like in the future, right? And when they're doing all of this writing about the digital world from the European perspective, these futures excluded people of color from the narrative. Oftentimes, people of color would even be written as like the alien or the other, right? So there wasn't necessarily a space for people of color to be the protagonist when being written about by a different perspective. And this is where Afrofuturism comes in because, you have in the 1990s, Mark Derry, who was not a Black person at all, but he was interviewing some up-and-coming Afrofuturist Black science fiction writers, right? And he asks this very poignant question. He says, why don't more Black people write science fiction? So he's asking that question in the 90s. And so you have this, this essay that he popularized the term Afrofuturism to kind of describe the type of Black science fiction he was thinking of when he asked that question, why don't more Black people write science fiction? He was thinking of this version of Afrofuturism. And as you notice in the beginning of the presentation, that is not how I described Afrofuturism, right? So the terminology has kind of rolled over and morphed as time goes, and as more people come to engage with the topic, our understanding of it has come to grow and change as well. But this is his original interpretation of Afrofuturism, and this was written in his essay called Black to the Future. If anyone wants to look it up, you can actually read these interviews that he's having with these prominent writers like Samuel Delany, and Greg Tate and people of that nature. So that was a really interesting one. But what I want to touch on is he's asking, why don't more Black people write science fiction? And this is the 90s. So in the next slide, I think the question that was sparked was maybe ill-timed, right? Because you're asking, why don't more Black people write science fiction? But here you have evidence of Black people writing science fiction as early as 1902, right? So this isn't something that has been, just bubbling up, just coming to the surface. Black people have been engaged with speculation and speculative fiction since before the word even became popularized, right? So I like to bring up this one here because you have, the literary greats such as W.E.B. Du Bois, which a lot of people don't necessarily associate him with science fiction or with fiction writing, but yet still here is his short story, The Comet, right? There is one note on Black No More by George Skylar. This one is probably the most interesting one, and this was the first one I encountered of early Black science fiction, early Afrofuturism. This story is interesting because essentially a man invents a device and a methodology to turn Black people white. And this creates a whole world of satire and irony in which people who were born white are now worried that there are Black people who look white walking amongst them. And you would think that this would resolve a lot of racial issues, but in a sense, it actually exacerbates them. And so now you have the satire here is that the inventor, who was a white man, it ends up being mobbed by a group of white people who think that he's a Black man trying to pass for white. So there's a lot of, irony and satire and humor in this one. And so I would encourage everyone to check out Black No More. It's written in a different style because it is a little bit earlier, but it is very accessible and quite interesting and quite funny, especially because it is a lot of, social commentary, right? Which is science fiction and Afrofuturism does tackle social commentary. So in the next one, I will like to introduce, this isn't even an original thought. This is something that circulates a lot in Afrofuturistic circles of discussion, right? So Afrofuturism during our period of enslavement. I and a lot of other people consider Afrofuturism to go back well before people were able to document their thoughts and had the right to write and publish their thoughts, right? So it isn't that Black people weren't speculating on the future or having these thoughts back then. It's just that maybe they were not able to write them and express them in a way that is considered, publishable, right? And so if you think about enslaved Black people, when they were asking the question or speculating, what if I could escape my captivity? That is speculation. That, in essence, is a form of Afrofuturism because they are imagining what mechanisms could I use to escape from this. And these mechanisms include magic. They include realistic and probabilities such as the Underground Railroad. But for some people, the Underground Railroad was speculation because they're like, what are you talking about? An Underground Railroad? What technology is this that is allowing us to move from this space of captivity to freedom, right? So I want you to consider that as well, that even during the period of enslavement, Black people were engaged with speculation and therefore engaged with Afrofuturism, okay? So next one, we're gonna look at some contemporary novels before we move on to something a little bit more participatory. So I'm just highlighting these ones right here because they are pretty recent and a lot of people love to introduce these novels and these books. Some of these have won awards, such as the prestigious Hugo and Nebula Award. I see you. Yes, and so I would encourage you to check some of these out if you want to take a picture. Octavia Butler's Kindred is probably the doorway entry point to a lot of people's understanding of Black science fiction and Afrofuturism because it does engage with science, but it's a pseudoscience, right? It's the science of a Black woman who time travels for reasons unknown to us, time travels to the past and has to reconcile with her ancestors and encounter ancestors that she didn't know she had in order for her to live her life here in the future or in the present, essentially. And I love this book particularly because it always shocks people to read the first couple of lines where it's saying, I lost my arm on the way back. And the way she loses her arm is chef's kiss. So you have to read the book. It's a wonderful introduction to Black science fiction, and then it'll kind of whetten, or I guess open your appetite for more of this type of genre, and it's very accessible and very much readable. And I also want to highlight the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin. This one essentially is asking, so if I had to phrase this as a what if, right? 5th season asks, what if contemporary scientists are crazy and power hungry enough to shoot the moon out of orbit, and the only person who can pull the moon back into the orbit and end the turmoil of these just terrible seasons that are going on Earth, right? Volcanoes erupting, crevices opening in the middle of the world, air that's unbreathable, really terrible exacerbations of what we're experiencing now, but exacerbated because the moon is no longer in orbit to control these seasons. And the only person that can pull it back into orbit is a small 11-year-old mixed race Black girl who doesn't even know she has the power to do this, right? So when you talk about dealing with, issues of environmental and ecological concerns, Afrofuturism also touches on that, which makes it so fascinating to read, because it's all of these different identities and concerns that are bubbling up and that are kind of being grappled with in these novels. So please, please, please read them. Like, I love this genre so much. And then, to kind of wrap it up, I want you to always consider the question, when you think about the future, not just right now, but like 3-4 generations, right? Do you exist there, right? Do your descendants exist there? Do people who look like you exist in that future? In the future that we're presented right now, when we talk about, techno-science and people try to advertise laptops and new technology to us, are there people who look like us engaged with these technologies, right? And so earlier we spoke about Mark Derry's infamous question, why don't more Black people write science fiction? And then we even touched on the fact that Black people were pretty much engaged with science fiction. This question wasn't necessarily one that needed to be asked, right? I want us to consider that in 2019, Russell Leddett tweeted this. It's a famous tweet now because it's been retweeted and reposted so many times. And it's oftentimes been taken out of context to shorten it to say, we are our ancestors' wildest dreams, right? So when you reflect on the things that we briefly discussed today, I want you to consider your participation, right? And I want you to remember that 4, 5, 8 generations ago, there was somebody before you who speculated on your autonomy, speculated on your freedom, somebody who speculated on your ability to exist and do what you want to do in the world and move about as a free person, right? And when we consider that version of the narrative, technically speaking, your existence is Afrofuturistic. Yeah? All right, so let's speculate. All right, what I would like you to do, take out your mobile phones, if you can. Go to www.menti.com and type in that code for me. And what we are going to do is we are going to speculate. I want you to contribute your speculations. And what do I mean by that? I want you to make considerations for your identities, the various identities of you, because no one just has one identity, right? I'm not just a Black woman standing here yelling at you about the future. Consider your varying identities. Consider your relationship to technology and consider your relationship to science. Or if you find that your identity doesn't overlap with science and technology, consider why that is, right? And then I want you to ask a question of what if? Simple what if question. And I'll show you some examples because of course I have them up here. All right. And the code is up here at the top in case anyone still needs it, menti.com. So let's ask questions of what if. In this instance, I'm asking, what if plants could hack our computers and other technology? What would they do with that? And Israel knows how much I love plants. So of course I was like, what if plants could hack us? Would they shut down everything and maybe, cause us to fall into an apocalypse? What if the US government became TikTok famous? Oh, I'm sorry. So the code is 43663800. Thank you. Thank you guys so much. I'm so appreciative of your speculations. I'm so appreciative of your contributions to these speculations. And keep in mind that if you are asking the question of what if, then you are fully capable of creating science fiction, right? Because all it takes is a consideration for your relationship between yourself and your identity and science and the future and obviously technology. Thank you guys so much.
All right, we're going to continue with our program. Tiffany, by the way, thank you so much. And I wanted to mention too that Tiffany is a new librarian at the Padron campus. And when our supervisor sent out her bio, I looked at her bio and I said she has to come here to North Campus. So welcome to Miami-Dade College. Welcome to Learning Resources. You're going to have a great future here with us. All right. Our next guest speaker is Trevor Thompson, who currently serves as head chef here at the North Campus with Campus USA, now known as Canteen. He started as a prep cook, worked his way up to line cook, and eventually became the manager. Trevor has been featured at Miami-Dade College's The Reporter, a student newspaper. And one of those times was for being a champion for chili. So I want to welcome him. And where is he? I don't see. Oh, here he is. Come on.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. As he said, my name is Trevor. I'm one of the supervisors here at Miami-Dade North Campus. I started, like he said, I'm not going to get into the story. But what a great speakers we had today. I learned so much from them. They came with side shows, so Israel get to take a break with me. I brought food. So I'm here today to talk about the art of food. A lot of people do not look at food as art, but to us it is art. That's something that our culture and the Black community built upon. In the 1960s, they called it soul food. But here, I'm here to speak about before the 1960s, before they called it soul food, they had food cooking in the 1800s. I'm a little nervous. Y'all forgive me for this. In the 1800s, it started off with jambalaya in the state of New Orleans and the little town of and the state of Louisiana and a small town, New Orleans, which you guys are familiar with. Jambalaya was created as two dishes. One dish was a seafood dish and a sausage dish with chicken, and they created as soup and as rice. So today I brought rice, and with the rice, New Orleans invented for something that's supposed to be spicy. Today is not spicy because I gotta share it with you guys. But I also brought cornbread, and cornbread was made in South America. Cornbread actually started off as a food that was for the sick, for people to eat it easier, to swallow it easier. A lot of people don't know that. It came to America and they created a solid food. Also, I brought string beans, which string beans is not really a Black culture food, but we brought it into our community as a Black culture food when we add bacon, potatoes, and onions in it. And our parents hooked it up. It started as a England food that was made for oh my God. This is my first time speaking in live. Like, I never did this, so forgive me for this. I also brought a dish, fried chicken. Chicken was made in the Black community because due to the fact, can I ask anybody, do y'all know why we make chicken in Black community? Because it's good. We made we made chicken in the Black community because due to the fact that was what we got as slaveries. We got a lot of chicken that they fed us, certain things as chitlins, oxtails, that we made into a dish today and is famous. Fried chicken was one of the dishes, including barbecue chicken, stewed chicken, and it started in the Black community. So we had to take many dishes and involve it into the Black community because in slavery, that's what we was getting. Chicken was one of the dishes that we had a lot. So we had to think of different ways to cook chicken because, come on, we eat chicken, baked chicken all day. It's going to be the same thing. You're going to get tired of it. So we had to come out with the different styles of chicken. The Black community came out with different styles of chicken because, we got tired of eating the same chicken. So here today, I brought a couple of food. I hope you guys like it. I know I should did better. I'm so, but thank you guys.
Trevor, you did great. And I know everybody's excited. So what we're going to do now is if you guys could form a line, that's what we're doing, right? And there are, yeah, go ahead, Arian. Oh, they're going to bring you a plate, so you don't even have to move. That's a first-class service here.
Everyone, may I have your attention, please? So we have another part to this. This is the food. We have an art exhibit next door on the other side. And the artwork that you see there was created by one of our very own Miami-Dade students. Yeah, thank you.